students still have not made up the educational losses caused by the pandemic, and eighth grade reading and math scores are down across the country. So I'm very excited to be joined by today's panel to discuss the national fight around education. John Rogers is a professor at UCLA's School of Education and Information Studies. He studies the relationship among democracy, education, and different forms of inequality. Laura Papano is an award-winning journalist and author of the book School Moms, which examined how public schools have been dragged into the culture wars. And Ronnie Lau is the Associate Director of Government Relations for the National Education Association. John, Laura, and Ronnie, welcome to the Rural Progress Summit. Before we start the discussion, just a quick reminder to our viewers that you can submit any questions through the Q&A button on your screen, and thanks again for joining us. John, I want to start with you. The big, beautiful bill, as I mentioned, created a national school voucher program. What is the most likely impact of a national voucher scheme like this?
I worry about the effect on public schools generally. As a national voucher scheme moves forward, there will be less resources for our traditional public schools that serve as anchors for the communities that they're serving. And that worries me greatly.
Okay. Well, I want to pivot into an open-ended question for everyone. What is your biggest concern about the future of public education with the current political climate at the state and national level? And maybe we'll start with Laura and go to Ronnie and then John.
Sure. Sure. So I actually think it's connected to the voucher question that you just asked. The big headline, I think, is that we are going to have an entire kind of group of students who are just simply not educated. If you look at the way the vouchers are being pitched, I've done a lot of reporting in Florida. I did a story 2 years ago when Florida first expanded to become the largest voucher program in the country. At that time, I looked at the data, and only 4% of the schools that were accepting vouchers were nonprofit, non-religious, and accredited. And I'm doing some more work now, and you look into how much the vouchers offer, the fact that the schools get to choose themselves, that we have a wellspring of for-profit schools, which are billing and taking this money. And it's a very troubling situation. And the top private schools are simply not accepting. And they can't. We don't have the capacity. I mean, 85% of kids attend public schools, 85 plus. So it's very problematic. We're going to have a lot of uneducated people in America.
One of the things we've seen in Iowa too is just really large increases in tuition that make the voucher really, ineffective in terms of making private schools accessible for kids that previously couldn't afford it. Ronnie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would really love to build off of what Laura has already mentioned. I think one of the biggest things I think about is that we already know that 95% of students with disabilities attend public schools. And so when we talk about, this historic divestment and with this new voucher program, it's only going to worsen and exacerbate for those types of students out there. And so I greatly, fear for what's going to happen to those students that have mental health needs or physical disabilities that are no longer going to have the investment to the needs of what they need to succeed. That's something that becomes top of mind for our members, for all parts of our leadership at NEA. And it's only going to worsen, especially in hard to staff regions, especially in rural areas out there. And when we're talking about this national voucher program too, I always like to emphasize that, there are no private or private schools out there or charter schools out there for any of these rural and southern communities. So where it actually harms the most is actually for those schools in the South and in rural areas, because they actually have nowhere to send their children other than to public schools. And so by divesting all that funding over to some of these institutions, there's not going to be a choice for any of these folks. This is only going to continue to exacerbate and provide benefits to those who are already rich and the wealthy. This is actually not something good for rural areas in that degree. So I always like to emphasize that. We're only going to see that to get worse with this new national voucher program.
One of the stats that always stuck with me when we passed our voucher program in Iowa was it was something like 20 Republican legislators who voted for the bill that didn't have a single private school in their district. And it would be really interesting to see those numbers in terms of how many private schools are actually in the districts of the folks who voted for this
And
bid.
even when the private schools are in the district, you get a $7,000 or $8,000 voucher and it costs $13,000 to go. And they don't cover transportation. Some of them don't cover meals. Some of them don't, uniforms, supplies. It goes on.
John, what are you watching?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way for me to make sense of the threat of the current moment is to take us back 5 years from today. I conducted a national survey of high school principals in June 2020 about their efforts to lead during the initial COVID lockdown. And in those uncertain and frightening days of spring 2020, American public schools played a critical role in sustaining communities threatened by a deadly virus and economic shutdown. Educators across the United States supported widespread efforts to meet the health and social welfare needs of students and families. Many schools distributed meals to students and family members, provided mental health counseling, helped students to navigate the healthcare system, and they sought to shore up housing insecurity. The early days of the pandemic reminded us that public schools contribute to our collective well-being. At their best, public schools are community schools that convene and connect public services, weave together the broader community, and foster social trust and understanding. Unfortunately, after those early days of lockdown, we've seen the clamor of angry and frightened voices that are amplified by conservative media, and they drown out the valuable lessons that we might have taken from those early days of the pandemic. And so my recent national study of superintendents from last summer found that these conflict campaigns have cost districts billions of dollars in additional security, staff turnover, additional legal fees. And those fiscal costs pale in comparison to the loss of public trust in our public schools that's led to the voucher enhancements that you just been mentioning.
Thank you. I also want to talk about the Department of Education. The Trump administration appears to have delivered on a longtime conservative goal to destroy the Department of Education. What will the loss of the DOE do to rural communities? We'll start with you, Ronnie.
Yeah, so one of the things, of course, is that they argue that they're trying to strengthen, education writ large, right, nationally. But in reality, the things that we're seeing, whether they're cutting funding or going to cut off funding and really exacerbate the ongoing needs for our classrooms, right? The things that we've been successful in look in tackling larger class sizes, tackling chronic absenteeism, all those things are going to get undone because of what they're doing at the Department of Ed. We know that there's going to be larger class sizes. We know that funding is going to be diminished to those things that support those students with disabilities I mentioned earlier. Mental health programs and those services that are provided for those students, those things are going to go away. And now most recently we saw, what they're trying to do in terms of potentially, injuncting funds from getting to school districts. And by enjoining that funding, we're going to see things like access to a well-rounded education and after-school programs are all going to no longer be available. Even in critical things that, this administration, tries to, tout their support for, like trade skill building programs. Those things are going to see loss of fundings in a number of different ways. So we have tremendous concern in terms of what this leads to and what this is going to end up in down the road for students.
John?
Yeah, a couple concerns I have relative to rural communities. One is that some of the most vulnerable families will have nowhere to go when their local school officials are acting in ways that undercut their rights, and when other students are acting in demeaning and hateful ways towards their classmates. The Office of Civil Rights basically has been entirely thrown away. And so in rural communities where there are no lawyers or other nonprofit organizations to turn to, the Office of Civil Rights has played a critical role. They no longer can play that role. The second thing that I'm really worried about is the evisceration of Title II. That's the program that has been supporting the ongoing development of teachers and school leaders. It's provided critical help to rural communities. I know in California, we have something called the California School Leadership Academy that's been working with communities across California, particularly rural communities, in helping them think through what do we need to do to support transitional kindergarten as it's been brought into the K-12 public education system, and how can we make sure that that transitional kindergarten is high quality, is serving the broad community. That's just been washed away as Title II has been washed away.
Laura?
I think of the DOE as providing a kind of frame because local education education is fundamentally local. It's, communities, it's states, but the federal government, as both Ronnie and John have mentioned, provides this kind of guide so that, students are protected, laws are followed, that there is recourse. What I worry about is that we get this situation where it's just the whim of the day directs how our education is going to look, and that people will not have support or recourse. I look at some of the rural communities that I've covered and written about, and they rely heavily on the kind of expertise, the guidance, the programs. I mean, in most places across America, only 8% of the budget comes from federal sources. On the other hand, in other communities, in rural communities especially, it's dramatically higher. And that money is often tied to requirements in order to get that money. And the Obama administration was very effective in kind of putting forward some of its programs by incentivizing using federal dollars. I do worry about what we are going to blanket incentivize or, on the contrary, not incentivize.
Ronnie, numerous studies have shown that Head Start provides a tremendous benefit for students. We've seen in recent months that the Trump administration is often illegally withholding federal funds that make these programs possible. Who stands to benefit from killing Head Start, and what will Americans lose if it's gone?
Yeah, Adam, I'm really shocked by this because honestly, there's really no brilliant answer about, who actually benefits from what they're trying to do right now. But what we do know is that students in our future is going to be directly harmed by this, right? And I'm glad Laura kind of talked about, how the Department of Education and how federal funding plays into play for public ed from K to 12 into higher education. But, for pre-K, it's really unique in the way where it is, deeply reliant on federal dollars in terms of providing this type of education to early childhood students. It's primarily because of the mixed provider system, and it's not a universal program like we see in the other areas of public education. And so with that said, we've already seen, these disruptions that are already occurring by this administration and their efforts of leading to closures and boarding up of already early childhood classrooms. We're already deeply seeing how this is affecting to worsen the lack of access to early childhood education, and it's only going to get worse because of this. And even on top of that, too, we touched a little bit about the Department of Education and what they're doing to shore up and close the department. We've already seen 5 out of 12 of the regional offices that lead a lot of Head Start implementation already close up based on this administration's priorities. So, like I said, I think this is a fundamental attack on our nation's future, and I'm not sure, who actually benefits out of this.
I also would say Head Start, in addition to developing young people in critical ways, it's an important democratic institution, right? Head Start builds networks of understanding and trust. It enables young parents to feel less isolated. It enables those parents to feel like their families have the support of the broader community and society. That's critically important.
Yeah, Head Start changes lives. One of the students that I have mentored over the years would not be where he is today if he did not have Head Start. He's from Mississippi. His mother had him when she was 15, but she got Head Start involved. He, became a voracious reader and ended up going to Yale, where I met him. And recently, he gave me a phone call when he earned his PhD, and he is now an education policy person in DC. And I said to him, your son will have a very different journey than you did because of the start of Head Start. And he does have a charming, delightful little munchkin of a son.
That's such a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Laura, conservative activists like Christopher Rufo have been, cherry picking obscure academic topics, weaponizing them into propaganda to convince parents that local schools are indoctrinating their kids with extremist ideas. What can we do to better defend against these tactics? And what has the impact of that fear really been on our communities?
Wow, where did it begin with Chris Rufo, right? I mean, some of the research I did for my book, I actually tracked, and I had a linguistic professor friend of mine look at the use of CRT and how he created it. And there was one thing that really struck me is he said when he was getting this rolling, he actually said in March 2021, we have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up the negative perceptions. We all know that CRT, SEL, um, what have you, these acronyms, they don't anymore stand for the things that they actually stand for. So, in answer to your question about what do we do, I would argue that we need the same energy and branding and marketing that we're seeing on the extreme side of the coin. I mean, this is nothing more than effective communication. When I was covering in rural Idaho, I was covering an election that was a school board election with some far right candidates. And I ended up speaking for an hour plus to one of the candidates' campaign managers, and I said to him, I said, what is it that what is SEL? I said, well, what is it that what's the problem with it, SEL? And he said, yeah, I said, you were in the Army. It's kind of like, get everyone on the same page so we can be a team. And he goes, we don't know what it is, but we don't like it. So that tells me that there's a communication problem, there's a language problem going on. And that is what we have to pay attention to because the facts don't stand up to the far right rhetoric, but nobody knows that because it's been so effectively communicated.
How do we start to tackle that branding problem? I mean, if you were on a school board or something like that, what would your approach be?
I would start telling stories. I mean, so my daughter during the pandemic was in Dallas ISD and she was out there every single day handing out school lunches and food for families. Have photos of that. Put that on, social media. We need the stories of the caring, handheld attention, caring teaching that is actually truly going on that nobody sees and that everybody takes for granted. Tell those stories.
That's so powerful. I will say, like, one of the few silver linings of Iowa's voucher programs, in my view, has been seeing our public schools become more proactive about sharing, the incredible outcomes that they create for students, knowing that they have to compete. And that's been really wonderful to see them, get out in front of this and share how, really world class our public schools are in this state.
And we need actually, I mean, you at the top of the program, Adam, you made the point that this is a national issue. We need a national, language, hashtag, conversation to a campaign to really talk about what it is that people are doing in public schools every single day.
Can I just jump in and say I agree that there's a communication problem that public schools have and that Christopher Rufo filled in that space and he kind of found the three words, critical race and theory, that were most scary to a public that was feeling a lot of fear. But I also would argue that public schools need to do a better job of including the broader community, engaging them in ways where members of the community feel like they have an authentic say, and they're not just being sold what public schools are doing. I think the best of educational leaders do that well, but many educational leaders have acted in a defensive way, and that's opened up space for some of this critical analysis to have ground to grow.
And John, I think just building on that point, I mean, what you saw with Moms for Liberty, right? I mean, schools are communities. And what we're seeing is we're seeing that just riven apart. We're seeing it broken. And I mean, I can tell you that when my kids were in school, I never knew what anyone's politics were. And it didn't matter. I didn't care. Nobody cared. But right now, people are lining up. And what is so powerful is that people are gathering people on teams at the local level. And, there are moms stepping up equally to
Yes.
gather people. And you know what? They're enjoying this community building. I've sat in rooms and I said, you guys are exhausted. You're working hard. You're trying to organize, but do you enjoy it? And even though they're exhausted, they have created this powerful community. Now, I've also listened to the Moms for Liberty podcast. And what I've gotten from some of those is that there are people who are brought into that circle who aren't necessarily true believers in every aspect of their, campaign, and yet they feel they have quote unquote friends and people that are like family. And we have to remember that schools are about connection, and that that connection ground up is what is going to bring us back.
Yeah, that's such a powerful message. I mean, I think about my first job as a campaign organizer, spending time up in Plymouth County, Northwest Iowa. And one night, I'm out knocking doors, no one's home, like 20 houses in a row. And I finally drove past the school. It turned out there was a volleyball game. And literally the entire town goes, right? Because that's the community center, that's the entertainment. It's so meaningful to people. And so finding a way, I think, to turn that into momentum for actually supporting our public schools is really important. And unfortunately, I think we also see a disadvantage, right? Like where the private schools can organize more explicitly around the families who are sending their kids there, right? Ask families to send letters and call their legislators and support these voucher programs. Public schools obviously can't really do that. And so there's sort of a structural disadvantage there that I haven't really figured out what to do with.
But I think, Adam, that you're pointing out something really interesting, which is that public schools may need to operate a little bit differently than they have in the past. A long time ago, they were virtually the only game in town. And, when we talk about competition, I really don't believe that vouchers create academic excellence or competition in any way whatsoever. But what they do is they do make public schools need to think a little bit differently about how they communicate, how they gather, how they frame what it is that they're providing. We talk about, everyone just focuses on the test scores, right? How are we performing? But you know what? As you just pointed out with that volleyball game, and there are so many communities where everybody shows up for whatever it is that the school is doing. And the question is, I mean, I look at the potlucks in a school that I support, everybody shows up for that. So how do public schools rather kind of officialize that job, right? Not just like lean on the PTO to do it. I mean, my daughter would always do popsicles on the playground every August and bring everybody in. I know a lot of schools do things like that, but how do we make it truly part of the job? Because private schools do that and it's part of their, fundraising, right? It's part of their philanthropy. Maybe the philanthropy for public schools is building community and allegiance and support.
For all, right? I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
what's different from private schools. The brand of public schools is democracy. It's about serving everybody. It's about enabling members of the community to see the strengths and virtues of people that are different from them, and that they can learn from other folks that are different from them, and that we all can work together and build a shared future. Private schools can't do that.
But I think to your point, and to the point of the last election, that it's really, really important to not use that 30,000 level democracy language, right? We've got to say, Priscilla and Joe are organizing and they are gathering everybody for, a potluck this day. I mean, it has to be really tangible. It has to be so on the ground.
Ronnie, you must spend a lot of time thinking about this. I mean, what's the language you're using when you're thinking about explaining the impact of public schools?
I mean, yeah, I really just want to echo everything from what John and Laura have already emphasized, right? I mean, when we talk to our educators, especially when we're fighting back against this, awful bill that moved through the budget process, it's about local impact, right? Our educators, more than anything, when we tell them, when we talk to them at their different workshops about how to advocate or how to be engaged with any type of decision maker or policymaker, including at the local level, is that always focus about what you know, right? And focus on what you know in the classroom, what you are doing exactly with your students day to day. I mean, no one knows that better than our educators, right? They see this day to day. They see what our students are going through, the economic impacts, what is facing the community writ large. They are the experts about that, right? Us in Washington, we can obviously talk about the detrimental impacts about what this is going to do as a nation, but most importantly, what happens back at home goes back to our educators. One of the things that we really try to emphasize too is about how can we get pro public education folks elected into office, right? At all levels of government. Really glad to hear that like we need to be engaged in these local elections and these local decision makers. But how can we provide as an alternative to some of these, Moms for Liberty type candidates or those who are backed by these folks? And we can really settle with that with our educators. NEA has a brilliant program called our See Educators Run program. We love to work with our educators who are interested in going into public office in any level of government and teach them how to effectively run a political campaign and how to go organize through that aspect and leverage the community partnerships and relationships that they have already naturally fostered through the numbers of years of them being a veteran educator, right? That is a great resource and they can really leverage that to be an effective policymaker down the road. So whether they're looking to run for an elected office to pose as a foil to what we're seeing, or just really become engaged, ultimately to everybody's point already is that what are we doing locally? What's happening back at home? How are folks coalescing at the local school? Whether it's through elections where oftentimes these schools are voting precincts, right? Or maybe a school library or even the school just the school campus is like one of the best Wi-Fi hotspots, right? There are ways where folks coalesce and meet together, and that is the best way we can engage other allies and community members to, continue that discourse and continue that conversation. That's the most beneficial thing we can do right now.
And I think that it's particularly important right now because I've covered the Moms for Liberty summits since they began. And after the last one, I was like, they are all over the map. I mean, this is before the election, and I thought, I'm not sure they're going to really last if they're as confused in their presentations as they were when I saw them in DC. And yet, as soon as the election happened, the support, their integration into the institutionalized far right, organizations, and now, I'm on their email list. They are organizing group education sessions all around the country to get people to run for office, and they are bringing resources. They are telling the stories on their website of new people joining. They're doing a podcast to talk about the experience that the people are having and the friendships they're building. I mean, it's, they have a lot of resources to do things, and that needs to be, we can meet, there are a lot of folks on the local level who are recruiting candidates to run, who support public schools, both Democrats and Republicans. I'm aware of some in rural Idaho who are working hard. But it's, I think it has to be even more organized.
That's a great point. When you think about Moms for Liberty, some of these other groups, and, it seems, at least from my perspective, that maybe they had a decent amount of popular support during the pandemic. Some of that has maybe faded, but they're really strong organizations. I mean, who's funding all this? Where are those resources coming from? And what are their motivations?
Yeah, well, I mean, I know, when we look at the money situation, one of the things I've been doing lately is spending a lot of time looking at some of the private nonprofits that are administering voucher programs, especially one in Florida. And if you look at who's on that board, they are people represented from national, DeVos, Walton Family Foundation, you look at, and even though they're a private nonprofit, they're going to basically be in charge this year of $5 billion of administering scholarships. If you also then look at who heads those groups, and then you look at the PACs that they're organizing, and you look at who's donating to the PACs from out of state, and you look at who those PACs are then donating to, the idea that this is all kind of, accidental, is ridiculous, because you can start connecting the dots. Transparency USA is a great website. I wish they were in all 50 states. But you can see who's donating, and it's stunning. There is nothing private nonprofit about this, except perhaps in the letter of the law, because everybody is friends with everybody and donating for an agenda that they all agree on.
One thing we've seen the last year is the spread of a lot of this to our universities and attacks on our universities. I have the University of Iowa, major university here in my district. We've seen, attacks on different professors. This year, the legislature created a, school of intellectual freedom based on the idea that, professors are censoring certain ideas, or certain ideas aren't represented enough on campus. We've seen all kinds of attacks on the types of language that can be used. What does it mean for America if our nation's universities, and in particular the public ones, are diminished?
If I can jump in as a representative of one of our public universities, just a few things we lose. We lose a commitment to open inquiry that is essential for scientific advancement and creative expression through the arts. We lose the capacity of universities to serve their communities with public health and legal assistance and educational support. Rural communities in particular lose core institutions that are essential to their economic well-being. So we're losing a lot with these attacks.
Yeah, at NEA, we also represent higher education faculty all across the nation. And I think, as John mentioned, this is just an attack on academic freedom, right? Part of the reason why higher education has existed for centuries is really just about the freedom of expression and thought, and the ability to critically think and challenge and research and have these discussions from diverse ideologies and really challenge each other, right? I mean, it's not about, we're one side of the aisle or the other, right? The part about higher education and universities and colleges, why they got created in the first place, is for us to have that kind of discussion and have that forum for both sides to have that free thought and challenge each other in that way. And so as we see these censorship tactics take place, and we're looking at research grants and other things being attacked and being rescinded back, this is a dangerous thing that's going to happen. In a place where we won't have the freedom and the ability for students and our higher education instructors to be able to look at the things that we need, there's not going to be the same type of developments and things of solutions that are going to be resolved as we've seen in centuries of that type of thought in higher education, what we've been able to produce.
So we have
I
a
would
question.
say.
Oh, go ahead.
I would just, to the higher education piece. We have been, people who support public higher education and freedom of, expression. We have been way behind on this. We have been playing from behind. I remember doing stories for the New York Times back in 2017, where I interviewed a teacher in Arizona who changed her course, the whole course, so that it wouldn't reflect things that were controversial, because she was afraid of being attacked by, students secretly, videotaping in class. That was back in 2017. And this has been slowly happening, the whole value equation, right? It's the wrong question, right? This is the wrong question. We are allowing ourselves to be backed up by a kind of campaign of bad questions because we haven't been paying attention to what's happening. So, I mean, and just one last point about the restrictions on the foreign students, absolutely devastating to the sciences and research. And I mean, I can't even, we could spend a whole hour talking just about that.
Yeah. And one of the things I find deeply ironic here too is like at least the campus in my district, Trump probably performed the best there of any candidate in at least any Republican candidate in at least the last 25 years. And so it's interesting that now is the time when there's all these attacks at universities at the same time that the students and young people are actually in some ways moving to the right.
Well, they
Um,
are, and because that's the cool kids. But I
yeah,
but I think the problem is that we've created this division, liberal, conservative. That shouldn't be the frame. And that's the problem, is that we've created this stark dividing line and forcing people to choose very extreme sides.
yeah, that's a great point. We have a question in the chat about DEI and sort of the conversation about DEI. It's a big can of worms, but I'm just curious your all's thoughts. I mean, how is DEI being used by conservative movements, and what does that fight look like for our public schools and for our universities?
I mean, I was on the campus in Florida, right when those things were happening, and I spoke with students who, some professors were just halting what they were saying. I was in the LGBTQ center, which, the offices were empty, the things were pulled off the walls. It affected, I mean, the students felt that they were suddenly unmoored. And I think it's having a kind of very stark effect. On the other hand, I did find professors who highlighted on their syllabi, this is in conflict with the law, and things that I say. And I think that bravery is really, really important. The problem is that the flip has happened. It's another language thing, is that then the conversation is, well, it's just about merit. Well, actually, if you look just on merit, we wouldn't be kicking people out of the military. We wouldn't be not allowing certain people to be considered. I mean, it's really stunning, because the language is merit, but that's not what's going on. So that needs to be called out.
And I think what we want to lift up, to draw upon John Powell's work from Berkeley, he talks about belonging. And most parents, whether we're talking about schools or we're talking about universities, want educational spaces to be spaces where everyone experiences a sense of belonging, where everyone's treated with respect. There's dignity afforded to all members of the school community or university community. That's what DEI at its best is about. We may need to shift our language, but we need to hold on to those core values, because those are values that are deeply and fundamentally about what is best about our country.
I
John,
mean,
I'm so glad.
I think it's become a little bit of a game, and I think there was that New York Times piece about the University of Michigan, which I think was a very kind of sobering consideration of the issue. And, having attended some of these trainings myself, I was in one where someone was yelling, "I can't talk to white people," and I'm thinking, well, why the heck are we all here then? Um, so I think there is, and I understand that some of that is out of frustration, but I think that we have not done a good job of navigating and balancing. We kind of go, take a while, then go all in, and then go, you know, we lose sense of, where we are and who we're with, but I think John is absolutely right. I mean, I just did a piece about a student who was, low income Black woman who didn't know she could do research. And at the University of Minnesota, because there was a DEI program, got into research. She's now a PhD candidate at Stanford. I mean, it's very important for people to feel they can belong in a very competitive, complicated space. And we have to figure out how to do that without making it some kind of a trigger word.
And just to build off of, being seen and being heard, I mean, John mentioned about how students need to be seen and heard in that way, where one thing that this agenda ignores is that our classrooms are becoming increasingly diverse, right? The population for what this country and who this country comprises of is going to continue in the trajectory where no longer is going to be a white dominated country. And so how can we reflect that in terms of the makeup of our classrooms? So everything that we're seeing right now against, anti-DEI and the campaigns against this is completely ignorant of the fact of what we're seeing in our classrooms and how this is going to continue and fundamentally change in terms of the makeup. And we have to reflect that in some shape or form.
And if I can just add one last thing, social change is hard, right? It's hard to deal with demographic change. It's hard to deal with changing mores around how people think about gender identity, but it's critically important. And we need our schools and our universities to address these issues so that we don't respond with fear and violence and othering, which is what the conflict campaigns of Moms for Liberty and much of the Republican Party is about right now.
I mean, if you look at the percentages of students of color, which you just pointed out, I mean, it is dramatically higher. It's going to get dramatically higher. And you know what? We need every one of them to be educated, to participate, and to be part of our society.
That's a great point. I kind of want to ask, it seems like one of the most frustrating things to me about our current conversation around education is we're sort of talking about, what we talked about in the last 40 minutes, and what gets lost sometimes is actually the performance of the students, what are things that schools can do to improve outcomes? How can we make sure that, kids in the United States are actually getting quality education? How do we shift the debate back in that direction? And what are some of the policies you all are seeing, in states or at the federal level that actually matter for improving outcomes for our kids?
I'll start by just talking about what I mentioned earlier about chronic absenteeism, right? I think, we've made some strides and waves in addressing a lot of that because we have to think about what keeps a student in the classroom in the first place, right? If they're not showing up, then they aren't the ones being able to benefit and learn and continue to progress academically, right? So we have to think broadly about, what is it that allows the student to feel seen, to what we were talking about earlier around DEI, but also just what keeps them going, right? What motivates them? And a well-rounded education and the services that we can provide, that there's a conduit of different things that a student can experience in terms of programming or curricula is so essential in that way. This was a big tenet in, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was the most recent reauthorization of the K-12 bill. That was a big tenet of making sure that there was across the board, whether you're interested in music and arts education, whether you're interested in career and technical work, whether you want to be a mathematician or become an engineer, all these things were available out there. And that was the goal, and be able to fund a number of these programs and courses and rarely have the universal, challenge of trying to make sure that this is available for every single student to have a diverse curricula in that way. And so by doing so, we can engage students in a number of different ways to keep them in the classroom and keep them, just readily engaged. Because sometimes that's all they really need to do is just show up at day one. And then once we do that, we can center on in terms of helping with that academic achievement. But we have to get them in there in the first place. And so as we see these attacks, as we see, the divestment in public ed and rescinding of funds, it's a dangerous slippery slope at taking away these services, taking away, the diverse curricula that we're able to provide for these students.
I would also add that, I mean, adults often talk about school as kind of acting upon students, meaning that, the academic inputs and then we'll get some outputs. But school is fundamentally social. And you don't, you are not teaching a subject, you're teaching students. And students are spending time with one another. And I think of so many times when I love interviewing kids and in classrooms, in schools, they're not there because they're like hungry to learn Algebra 1. They're there because they want to see their friends. And one of the things that I worry is happening is that we've created so much policing of students in schools. We are not letting them make mistakes on their own, out of the view of parents. I mean, the dumb stuff that we have all done, I was listing it to my family this past week and something, and they're like, oh my gosh, you did all that dumb stuff, really, Mom? It's like, yeah. And it's because you're hanging out with your friends, you learn from them, you learn because, and you feel connected. And that connection is what allows people to then learn. And I worry that a lot of the parental rights laws that we're seeing, where things have to get reported to parents, like, whoops, this is going to be, might be discussed, or this might, I mean, it's ridiculous. And I interviewed for a story, interviewed a dad of 7 in rural Idaho who made the point to me, and he was very conservative. And he said, but I don't worry about my kids being indoctrinated. He goes, I am enough of a parent to them that I know that they are going to hear what I have to say, and that they're going to, if there's something that confuses them, we're going to discuss it. And I think that, when I look at, the young students that I mentor in a journalism program, um, the school this year got Yonder packets to put phones, and I think that was a big theme in a lot of schools, is taking away the phones. They were all really upset before it happened. And, the video story they did to interviewing students ahead of time, could not have been more biased towards keeping phones. On the other hand, after it happened, there were people saying, I'm talking more with my friends, I'm hanging out, playing at recess instead of just sitting there on my phone. And, we have to be the grown-ups, and maybe we have to say, there are certain ways in which we are living as a society today that are hurting our ability to make schools the connected communal center that they need to be, and that the learning then comes after that.
I would quickly point to 2 policies that I think are really promising. One, NEA has championed, which is community schools. It's an idea that's been around since the origins of public schools in the United States, but gets lost, that schools need to be centers of their communities. They need to be places that social services, healthcare, community well-being is centered at. And I think rural communities do that well already, but I think we can add to that role of schools in servicing the broader community. The other point I would make echoes something Laura said, which is I think we need to create more opportunities for young people to share their voices and to be heard. At a moment when democracy is under threat, I think young people are the best conveyors of messages about why democracy matters. I followed very closely the walkouts that young people engaged in February, talking about immigrant rights. What was striking about those walkouts around the country is that young people often were walking out and talking about the needs of their classmates, that they cared about their classmates. They were talking about their mothers and their aunts and their grandparents and how they were committed to doing for them as was done for them. That sort of solidarity is what we need to reclaim, and young people are our pathway to do that.
John, I would add, one of the things that I do in my mentoring is we run a journalism program, eastrockrecord.org, if you want to check out the stories. And it's kids in grades 3 through 8. And I don't decide what we write about. They decide what they write about. And guess what? I learned from them what's going on. One of our lead stories was about immigration. They were deeply, deeply concerned for their families, for their family members. We had students fessing up and writing about the problem with vandalism in schools, which is happening people are vandalizing bathrooms, and in ways that just wasn't happening a few years ago. That to me tells me that there's a deep level of pain, frustration, not being loved and listened to. And I have found, in a strange way, the school newspaper and them knowing that they can interview the mayor, that their voices matter, their questions matter. We need to give them platforms to tell us what's going on.
That's such a great point. We have a couple questions here in the chat about how to get more involved in local school board races how to look for and recruit candidates, whether or not there's good groups that folks who are watching can go to find good candidates and get involved, and very interested in your all's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd just like to reemphasize again the See Educators Run program that NEA runs. I'm happy to share a link in the chat, or if I can provide to the folks here to help distribute it out there. It's a great way for us to help find those folks who are interested in running, or members of our union that are interested in running for public office and all facets of government. So it's a great way to see those who are engaged and who we have supported throughout that program, who have went through that training. And also, of course, the NEA Action Fund, that's our PAC, that we help support federal and state candidates in terms of those who we believe are pro-public education and could help, move the needle and move the conversation forward in terms of fighting back against, these folks that we talked about earlier.
I would say that there are a lot of in where there have been hotspots. There have been a lot of organic groups, often organized by moms, and they have become more, organized and codified because moms are organized, and they are many of the people that I have written about, connected with, are out there recruiting candidates for school board. And in some states, I think Pennsylvania is one of them. And I got just a message from someone in New Jersey. What I'm seeing is these groups creating kind of statewide coalitions increasingly. Also, the group Red Wine and Blue is a good resource for those in terms of organizing. They have a lot of resources.
Awesome. One of the interesting things there too, at least in Iowa, is we've had a move after Moms for Liberty performed pretty badly in the last round of school board races. There was some effort to try and make those races partisan because the idea was that that was what was holding them back. So I just find that all super interesting. We have a question from Annie in the chat about teaching of the arts, and how the new federal policy shifts will impact things like theater and art and music programs in our schools.
I'll start off by saying that the most recent announcement that we heard from a few days ago about how this administration is trying to rescind, or rather stop funding from being implemented in various areas. And one of those key places is Title IV Part A funding. And this is a block grant that was established in the ESSA bill that I mentioned earlier. And that specifically looks at supporting a well-rounded education, which when we looked at ESSA and to define the term well-rounded education, music and the arts was a very distinct two terms that we place within that definition. And that was the ability to let school districts who receive this funding, take a look and focus where, is music and arts education a place that they need to be funding for? And they have the flexibility of doing so with this block grant. And so as they look to, impound this type of funding, if that's the direction that they're taking, we could directly see federal funding, get blocked in this way from getting to these crucial programs. So it is a dangerous route, and I do worry about what's going to happen to that. But certainly, I think with the most recent announcement that those two types of programs will be impacted.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a former regional theater board chair, and the assault on the arts, at all levels is very distressing because it's not, the arts are often viewed as kind of quote unquote extras, but they are hardly that. The arts is the vehicle through which we understand ourselves and our world. And I think that when we talk about the mental health issues in schools, when we talk about this kind of need for connection and belonging, that it is incredibly important and powerful that we support these children in whether it's local. I mean, it's a problem at every level, the funding piece and the control piece that we're seeing, at the Kennedy Center even, right?
That's a great point. One more question I had, we touched a little bit on the situation with phones in schools, and I think about we passed a law this year in Iowa that I was proud to support. One of the things that was immediately clear to me, like I went in and talked to a classroom at the high school I went to, and the first 5 minutes of the class were not devoted to like getting all the kids to take their earbuds out, which to me, well, it was just a huge change from what I've experienced in recent years, and so that felt like a big win to me. But I'm curious more broadly, you know, given what we're learning about technology and young people, how you all think about what's happening in our schools, whether we should be reassessing one-to-one programs with, giving every student a laptop and stuff like that, and just, what the state of play is there.
I mean, I think kids need laptops. When I first started doing the journalism program, people would write out their stories and then I would have to go home and type them. Now the kids write on a laptop. I can't really think without a keyboard. On the other hand, I think there is way too much technology, and the one-to-one can be useful, but I think ultimately it has to be very strategic and limited. I really, as someone who's watched education for over 30 years, the most powerful things you hear from students are about the relationships with their teachers and their students. So yes, technology can be helpful and strategic, but ultimately it has to be about the relationship. And and I'm not. I think we probably overuse the technology in classrooms.
So it's about the relationships, absolutely. And it's also about what sort of work we want young people to do. If schools are about simply taking in information from teachers, laptops are not particularly useful. Paper and pencil is not particularly useful. Like it all is boring and it's all stultifying and isolating for young people. What young people want is to participate in activities where they're inquiring about questions that they are not yet certain of, where they're engaging in creative work, where they're collaborating with fellow students, figuring things out, identifying ideas that have not been thought of before. Technology can be useful for that, but then it's a tool towards something bigger. And that's what we need to focus on.
Yeah, my kids in the journalism, they love sometimes writing together, right?
Yeah.
So, get a Google Doc and do it. On the other hand, we do have to pay attention to AI. And I did get a one opinion piece that was clearly a chat GPT generated. And so we had a conversation. But, that is going to be part of, we all use, we all search and use that information. I think that that conversation has to be part of things as well.
Great. Well, I want to just ask with my final question, what is maybe one thing that's happening in the education space, whether it's through this big, beautiful bill or federal changes that you just want to elevate, people might not know about? And then what's maybe one, not enough talked about reform that you are thinking about that you'd like to see policymakers implement? And we'll try to do it as like a lightning round.
Okay, I'll go really quickly because I am obsessed with the worry about vouchers, and I think we not need to not only look at what the legislation says, but how and who is administering it.
So I'm sitting here in Los Angeles and I'm deeply worried about immigrant communities and young people and families who are under attack on a daily basis in parks, in schools, in their communities. And until that threat goes away, we're not going to have quality education because you can't have quality education in an environment of fear.
One thing that I would love to touch on is the higher education aspects of the bill of the bill that just went through. One thing we didn't touch on is just the access and what it does to stifle some of that. The bill looks to tackle in a different number of ways around repayment and what types of loans are being lended out in the future for access to higher education, and it's really dangerous in a way where we haven't long-term resolved the cost of college, right, and the cost of a post-secondary education. So I have deep concerns in terms of how folks are going to be able to repay for some of the loans they'll be able to take out under the new plan, and just the over-reliance then to resorting to private banks and higher interest rates because the federal government will no longer be able to provide them those types of loans and that types of lending that's public access.
Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining us for this panel. I thought it was a really interesting conversation, and I'll just end by saying, the logo on my campaign sign is literally the bell tower of Iowa City High School, which was a WPA project under FDR in one of the most beautiful public schools in the country. And so we really can accomplish great things in public education when we work together and make investments. And we definitely talked about some challenges, but I'm leaving this panel feeling really inspired. So thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.